Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from living in a hotel room. Not the bright, transient loneliness of a traveler passing through on a business trip, but something deeper, more permanent. The kind that settles into the walls and the low hum of a window air conditioner. The kind that echoes in the long corridor between checkout and somewhere better. For Colleen Bagley, 50 years old and originally from the quiet suburb of Fox Lake, Illinois, a hotel had become her home. And within that home, a storm had been quietly gathering for years, invisible to most, but felt acutely by the woman at the center of it. Colleen had been living with her boyfriend, Arturo F. Taylor, at the In-Town Suites extended stay hotel on Landmeyer Road in Elk Grove Village, a mid-sized Chicago suburb sandwiched between the hum of O'Hare International Airport and the flat expanse of Cook County farmland. The hotel, a modest extended stay establishment with small kitchenettes and the kind of worn carpets that absorb years of other people's stories, had been their shared address for approximately 2 years. For 9 years before that, Colleen and Arturo had been a couple, or at least that was how it appeared from the outside. 9 years is a long time. Long enough to build a life. Long enough for the cracks in that life to spread unnoticed, right up until the moment they could no longer be ignored. Fox Lake itself is a small, largely residential town in Lake County, Illinois. The kind of place where neighbors wave from driveways and children ride bicycles along tree-lined streets in the summer. It is the sort of town that could not easily be associated with violence, and Colleen Bagley was the sort of woman who, to those who knew her, seemed like she belonged in the gentler rhythms of that world. But her life had taken turns that had led her far from anything resembling stability, sharing cramped quarters with a man who, it would emerge, had long been a source of fear rather than comfort. The warning signs, as they so often are, had come before the tragedy. In a separate incident at a hotel in Schaumburg, another Chicago suburb, not far from Elk Grove Village, the Schaumburg Police Department had been called to deal with Taylor and Bagley as unwanted subjects. What happened during that encounter would haunt the story of Colleen's final days. At that time, Colleen had spoken to police officers directly, telling them with raw honesty that she was afraid that Arturo would become physically aggressive toward her. She told them she believed he was cheating on her. She told them she believed he was taking her money. The words had been spoken. They were in a police report. And yet, in the way that so many warnings about domestic violence do, they dissolved into the bureaucratic machinery of a system overwhelmed by the sheer volume of human suffering it is asked to process. The incident was logged, but the danger was not permanently separated from the woman who feared it. Colleen and Arturo continued on together. February 21st, 2026, began as an ordinary day in Elk Grove Village. The winter air outside the In-Town Suites was cold and gray, the parking lot half empty, the kind of morning that blurs into the next without leaving much of a mark. But inside the hotel, something had broken open. Arturo Taylor and Colleen Bagley argued that morning. A dispute about one of the other female residents at the hotel. It was the kind of argument that, when it erupts in a relationship already corroded by jealousy and mistrust, carries an energy entirely different from an ordinary quarrel. This was not two people disagreeing about something small. This was years of accumulated suspicion and fear finally forced into the open between four walls. What happened next was captured, in part, by the cold and impartial eye of hotel surveillance cameras. Colleen Bagley was recorded leaving the hotel that morning, stepping out into the parking lot and walking alongside another person whose identity has not been publicly established. She appeared on footage shortly afterward at a nearby Walgreens, making a series of purchases, among them a bottle of bleach. She returned to the hotel at around 8:45 in the morning. The surveillance cameras recorded her walking back inside. They never recorded her walking out again. No one saw Colleen Bagley alive after that moment. What followed, behind the closed door of their shared room, remains in the darkest territory of this story. Arturo Taylor strangled Colleen that day. And then, as if strangulation were not enough, he used not one but two knives, a folding blade pocket knife and a large butcher knife, to stab her in the chest. The Cook County medical examiner would later determine that her cause of death was multiple sharp force injuries. She was 50 years old. She had told the police she was afraid. She had been right to be afraid. In the days that followed, the hotel corridors continued their ordinary routines, unaware of what had happened behind the closed door of room. Arturo Taylor, meanwhile, appeared to be constructing an ordinary life around an extraordinary secret. On February 24th, 3 days after Colleen's death, he walked to the hotel front desk and asked staff to activate only a single key card for the room. In doing so, he quietly erased Colleen's access to the space she had shared with him. He then visited another room elsewhere in the hotel, where a mutual acquaintance of both his and Colleen's happened to be staying. He told this person, in a casual and unremarkable way, that Colleen had left him 3 days ago and never come back. It was the kind of statement designed to plan a story before anyone thought to ask questions. He was already managing a narrative. He was already building his alibi. But Arturo Taylor had a problem that no amount of narrative management could easily solve. Colleen's body was still inside that room. By the early hours of February 25th, 2026, Taylor appears to have made a decision. Surveillance footage from the hotel's parking lot captured him at approximately 1:57 in the morning, moving through the darkness with purpose, carrying a pink garbage bag in the direction of the row of large dumpsters at the edge of the parking lot. He was recorded walking toward them. And then, more than 15 minutes later, he was recorded walking away from them. What the cameras could not show was the effort, the desperation, and the grim reality of what Taylor had done before that walk. Investigators would later piece together, both from physical evidence and from Taylor's own account, the full picture. He had attempted to clean the room with bleach, but had grown too exhausted to finish. He had placed Colleen's body inside a suitcase. He had thrown the suitcase down a stairwell. He had dragged it across the parking lot in the dark. He had attempted to lift the suitcase into the dumpster, but was physically unable to hoist it over the edge. And so he had done what a person does when they run out of options and out of strength. He had left her there, still wrapped in a white blanket with a distinctive blue check pattern, propped against the outside of the dumpster, as though she were simply more refused to be collected with the morning trash. It was around 4 o'clock in the morning when a person walking through the parking lot saw the bundle. Something about the shape of it, the stillness of it, the wrongness of it, stopped them. They got closer. And then they found Colleen Bagley, 50 years old, from Fox Lake, Illinois, lying beside a dumpster in the pre-dawn darkness of an Elk Grove Village parking lot, wrapped in a blanket and discarded like something of no value. At 4:18 in the morning, the Elk Grove Village Police Department and fire personnel responded to a report of an unresponsive person at the hotel on Landmeyer Road. Officers arrived to find Colleen. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation that followed moved with both speed and precision. Detectives from the Elk Grove Village Police Department requested the assistance of the Major Case Assistance Team, known in Illinois law enforcement circles as MCAT, recognizing immediately that the circumstances demanded a thorough and coordinated response. The scene told a story before anyone had spoken a word. Blood stains, drag marks, a trail of evidence that led from the area near the dumpster directly back to the hotel room that Arturo Taylor had quietly reclaimed with a single key card the day before. Inside the room, investigators found both knives, the folding pocket blade and the large butcher knife, still present. They found Taylor's jeans and gym shoes marked with what appeared to be blood. They found a pillow with the same blue check pattern as the blanket that had been wrapped around Colleen's body. And they found Arturo Taylor. He had not fled. He was still at the hotel when police arrived, and he was carrying Colleen's phone. Whether this detail speaks to arrogance, to calculation, or simply to the strange paralysis that sometimes overtakes people who have done terrible things, it is difficult to say. What is known is that Taylor agreed to accompany officers to the police station for questioning. It seemed, on the surface, like the cooperative gesture of someone with nothing to hide. But at the police station, something shifted. Taylor attempted to harm himself. Officers responded. He was taken to a hospital, treated, and released. And it was after his release from the hospital, after whatever internal reckoning had occurred during those hours, that Taylor sat across from detectives and began to speak. He admitted to strangling Colleen. He admitted to stabbing her. His explanation for the violence was that she had pulled a pocket knife on him first, that he had acted in response to her aggression. It was the kind of claim that investigators examined carefully and skeptically, particularly in the context of the physical evidence, the prior domestic violence reports from Schaumburg, and the elaborate steps that had been taken in the days following Colleen's death to conceal what had happened. The medical examiner's office conducted an autopsy and formally ruled Colleen Bagley's death a homicide caused by multiple sharp force injuries. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office approved charges of first-degree murder against Arturo F. Taylor on February 27, 2026. He was transported to the George N. Layton Criminal Courthouse in Chicago for a detention hearing. Before Cook County Judge James Murphy III, prosecutors presented the full weight of the evidence. The surveillance footage, the physical evidence from the room, the drag marks, the knives, the blood on Taylor's clothing, the lies told to the mutual acquaintance, the deactivated key card, and asked that Taylor be detained without bail pending trial. Judge Murphy III agreed. Taylor was ordered held in the Cook County Jail, where he remained as the legal process moved forward. The Elk Grove Village Police Department, in its public statement, offered condolences to Colleen Bagley's family and friends, a formality, but one that carried weight, because behind every case number and every piece of forensic evidence, there is a person. Colleen was 50 years old. She had fears she had been brave enough to voice to police. She had a life that had become entangled with someone who chose violence. She had walked to a Walgreens on a cold February morning and bought bleach, and she had walked back to the hotel, and she had never walked out of it again. What the surveillance cameras documented, her exit that morning, her return at 8:45, her disappearance from the frame, is, in its own quiet way, one of the most haunting aspects of this case. There is something in that last recorded image of woman walking back through a door that carries the terrible weight of finality. She did not know in that moment that it was the last footage that would ever exist of her alive. She could not have known. And yet the camera caught it, preserved it, and handed it to investigators as evidence of the last moments before the world changed irrevocably. Cases like Colleen Bagley's exist at the intersection of several painful truths that communities across the country continue to grapple with. The persistent difficulty of protecting people from domestic violence before violence occurs. The complex emotional and financial entanglements that make it extraordinarily difficult for victims to leave dangerous relationships. And the quiet way in which warnings can be heard, but not acted upon until it is too late. Colleen had told police in Schaumburg that she was afraid. She had named what she feared. And she had remained, as millions of people in similar circumstances do, in a situation that ultimately claimed her life. As of March 2026, Arturo F. Taylor remained in the Cook County Jail, held without bail, awaiting the full legal process. The case against him, as presented by prosecutors, was built on surveillance footage, physical forensic evidence, the testimony of a mutual acquaintance, Taylor's own admissions to detectives, and the chain of deliberate actions taken in the 4 days between Colleen's death and the discovery of her body. His defense, if it ultimately rests on the claim of self-defense, will be tested against all of it. Colleen Bagley was a woman from Fox Lake, Illinois, a woman who had lived, who had feared, who had hoped, and who deserved far better than the end she was given on a cold February morning in a hotel room in Elk Grove Village. Her story, like so many stories of victims of domestic violence, does not end with a resolution that brings comfort. It ends with a body beside a dumpster in a parking lot, with a blanket pulled over her as though to keep her warm, and with the echo of words she had once spoken to a police officer, words in which she described, with quiet precision, the exact nature of the danger that would eventually take her life. Story 2. There is a quiet kind of beauty to the rolling plains of central Oklahoma. The land stretches wide and low, dotted with old oaks and shallow creeks that cut through red clay soil. The towns here are small, the kind where people know each other's names, where children ride bicycles in front yards and neighbors wave from porches. Macomb, Oklahoma, is exactly that kind of town, the kind of place where tragedy feels impossible until the morning it isn't. On a warm Friday in September 2023, a 30-year-old woman named Michaela Faye Meave left her workplace for what she hoped would be the last time she would ever have to see the inside of the house she had once called home. She never arrived at her new beginning. She never made it out of that driveway. And 5 days later, the peaceful town of Macomb would be shaken to its roots, changed in the way only grief can change a community forever. Michaela was born on June 15, 1993, in Oklahoma City, a city that hummed with ordinary life, where nobody imagined they were bringing into the world a child whose story would one day be told on national television, dissected by investigators, mourned by strangers. She grew up in Lexington, a small town in Cleveland County, alongside her sisters, Andrea and Megan, in a household that knew both warmth and the inevitable complications of family life. Her parents, Barbara and Michael, eventually separated, and her mother later married Scott Harper, a man who would come to love Michaela as his own. From a young age, Michaela carried a brightness that those around her could not help but notice. She loved music in the way that some people love breathing, with a kind of deep, unthinking necessity. She believed in God and wore that faith openly, not as a performance, but as a quiet anchor. She was gentle with animals and gentler still with people who were hurting. Those who knew her well spoke of a woman who walked into any room and immediately began looking for whoever needed help. It was not an act. It was simply who she was. When Michaela learned that she would never be able to have biological children, she did not collapse into despair. Instead, she opened her arms wider. She found 2 children, a daughter, Adrienne, and a son, Brian, waiting in the state's foster care system, children who needed someone to love them without condition. Michaela gave them exactly that. She adopted them both, and from that moment forward, she called herself a mother without hesitation, without asterisks, without qualification. She pursued teaching because of the same instinct, the desire to shape young lives, to offer something steady to children who might otherwise drift. By 2023, she had built a quiet, meaningful career as a PAR educator at Macomb Public Schools, working every day alongside children who needed extra support, extra patience, extra kindness. She also volunteered in the after-school program, staying late, giving more of herself than the job technically required. Her colleagues described her as devoted. Her students simply loved her. It was on Facebook, of all places, that Michaela's romantic life took the turn that would eventually lead to her death. She came across a familiar name one afternoon, Frank Byers, a man she had known from high school, whose face had grown older in the way that all faces do over a decade. They began talking. The old connection reawakened. Frank was a father of 4 daughters, Daisy, Lily, Chloe, and Zoe, and Michaela, with her instinct for nurturing, did not see the children as a complication. She saw them as a gift. The relationship deepened, and in June 2022, Michaela and Frank were married. Their blended household became a home of 6 children, 2 parents, and the tentative hope of a family that worked. But hope without honesty is fragile. Within a year of the wedding, the cracks began to appear. Frank, it turned out, had not offered Michaela the faithfulness their marriage had promised. He was unfaithful to her, not once, not casually, but persistently, openly, and without apparent remorse. His infidelity became so brazen, so relentless, that investigators would later discover he was sending photographs to other women on the very day his wife lay dead, and again on the morning of her funeral, asking a woman how he looked in his tuxedo. These were not the mistakes of a man racked with guilt. They were the actions of someone who had already moved on before his wife was even buried. Michaela bore the fracturing of her marriage with a dignity that cost her enormously. She had loved this man, had embraced his children as her own, had restructured her entire life around a future that turned out to be built on sand. At some point in the months before her death, she stopped living inside the main house and retreated to a shed on the property. It was a humiliating arrangement. A woman reduced to sleeping in an outbuilding on her own land while her husband lived inside. But Michaela was not broken. She was planning. She had told her family that she wanted a divorce, that she was ready to leave, that she had endured enough. By September 2023, Michaela had made her decision final. 3 months of separation had given her the clarity she needed. She arranged to return to the house one last time, on September 15th, a Friday afternoon, to collect her belongings and close that chapter of her life completely. She was 30 years old. She had 2 children who needed her. She had a job she loved and a community that valued her. She had every reason in the world to walk out that door and never look back. Frank Byers, however, had other plans. What happened inside the shed on that September afternoon is something that only the evidence speaks to now, because one of the 2 people who was there is dead, and the other has admitted to killing her. Investigators believe that Frank Byers shot Michaela twice in the head at close range on the afternoon of September 15, 2023, somewhere on the property, likely inside or near the shed where she had been staying. The murder weapon, believed to be a .22 caliber firearm, left behind brass casings stamped with the letter F. What Frank did next reveals something important about the kind of person he is. Not a man overcome by passion, not someone who acted in a moment of blind fury and then recoiled in horror at what he had done. He was deliberate. He was methodical. He went to work. He contacted a neighbor and retrieved a roll of carpet that the neighbor had given him months earlier. He used that carpet to wrap Michaela's body. He had purchased a mop, bleach, and ammonia from Walmart. A receipt later found by investigators confirmed this, and used them to clean the scene. He mopped blood. He swept away evidence. He did all of this calmly and systematically while the body of the woman he had married was rolled up behind him. Then he got in his car and drove to pick up his daughters from school. He drove them around for several hours. He performed the role of father, of ordinary man, of someone with nothing to hide. Around 8 o'clock that evening, he returned home and began the grim second phase of his plan, moving the body. He drove Michaela's remains to a ditch near Hamilton and Prospect Roads, not far from the property, on a stretch of rural highway between the towns of Etowah and Macomb. He pulled her from the vehicle at the edge of the ditch and let her roll down, 12 to 15 feet, to the creek bed below. Then he climbed down after her and dragged the carpet-wrapped body into a drainage pipe that ran beneath the roadway. He left her there in the dark, in the dirt, beneath the road. He covered his tracks and drove home. But Frank Byers was not done fabricating his story. He removed the SIM card from Michaela's phone and inserted it into a different device, using it to create a fake text conversation. Messages crafted to suggest that she was alive, that she had simply left voluntarily, that nothing was wrong. He sent fabricated messages from her social media accounts. He was constructing, piece by piece, the portrait of a woman who had walked away on her own terms. The next morning, September 16th, Frank Byers reported his wife as missing. When Lieutenant Dakota Black of the Pottawatomie County Sheriff's Office received the call, she drove to the Byers property with the instincts of someone who had spent years reading landscapes and people with equal precision. Black was a trained tracker, a skill that goes beyond simply following footprints in dirt. It means reading disturbance in nature, noticing what has been moved, bent, or disturbed in ways that do not belong. She would later describe the Michaela Meave case as one of the most heart-wrenching of her career. Frank Byers stood before the officers and told his story with practiced calm. He said that Michaela had been seeing men online, that she had an arrangement with him that allowed it, that on the afternoon of September 15th she had told him she was going out. He described a tall man with a dark beard, slightly balding, driving a white Chevrolet pickup truck with tinted windows. Michaela had gotten in, he said, and driven away. He hadn't thought much of it at first, he claimed, because that's what she did. She came and went. Michaela's family, when they heard this account, reacted with immediate and absolute disbelief. They knew their daughter, their sister. The woman Frank was describing, casual, carefree, involved in open arrangements, was not Michaela. She was a devout, deeply loving mother who had been quietly preparing to leave a marriage that had hurt her. She had been asking for a divorce. She had been packing her things. She had been planning her future with her children, not arranging romantic meetings with strangers. Light Black and Detective Marcus May worked alongside each other, methodically gathering evidence from the property. What they found told a story that contradicted Frank's account at every turn. 2.22 caliber shell casings were recovered near the shed. Bloodstains marked the scene. Broken glass suggested a struggle or violence. Mops, bleach, and ammonia indicated a vigorous attempt to clean a space. And perhaps most damning of all, home security camera footage that Frank had saved on his phone, footage he apparently believed he had deleted, captured images that investigators found deeply troubling. They also found, buried in Frank's digital footprint, the truth about the SIM card. He had swapped it between phones and used Michaela's number to send messages designed to mislead investigators. The texts were fabricated. The alibi was constructed. And the blood found on Frank Byers' own boots told its own quiet, damning story. For 5 days, the search continued. Volunteers combed the woods. Michaela's family drove rural roads, called her name, and pressed their hands together in prayer. Her mother, Barbara, and stepfather, Scott, described the experience later as feeling like an eternity compressed into a week, every hour heavier than the last, every silence more suffocating. On September 20th, 2023, Michaela's cousin was searching near Hamilton and Prospect Roads when she came upon something that stopped her cold. A rolled-up carpet lay in a drainage ditch, tucked into a culvert beneath the road. She made the call that broke her family's world apart. Michaela Faye Meave was found wrapped in that carpet, 2 gunshot wounds to the head, her body in a state of decomposition consistent with 5 days of exposure. She was 30 years old. She was a mother, a teacher, a sister, a daughter. She had gone to collect her things and start over. She never made it out. The Pottawatomie County Sheriff's Office, working alongside federal partners, continued building the case through the following weeks. Digital forensics peeled back every layer of Frank Byers' deceptions. Investigators traced the fake text messages, identified the phone he had used to send them, and confirmed the SIM swap. They recovered messages he had sent to another woman, a woman he was actively pursuing, in which he had allegedly indicated that Michaela would not be a problem for much longer. His motive, as the prosecution would later frame it, was strikingly simple in its cruelty. Frank Byers wanted to start a new life, and Michaela, living on his property, seeking a divorce, refusing to disappear quietly, stood in the way. Rather than face a divorce, rather than divide assets and time and resources, rather than simply allow his wife to leave and rebuild her life, he ended her. The Walmart receipt for cleaning supplies, the borrowed carpet, the fabricated messages, all of it pointed to a murder that was not impulsive but planned. On the night of October 24th, 2023, law enforcement located Frank Byers at his brother's house in El Reno, Oklahoma, and placed him under arrest. He was 32 years old. He was charged with first-degree murder, unauthorized removal of a dead body, and desecration of a human corpse. The Pottawatomie County District Attorney, reviewing the premeditated and methodical nature of the crime, announced the pursuit of the death penalty. News of the arrest spread through Macomb and Lexington like a wave. People who had prayed for Michaela's safe return now sat with a grief that had nowhere to go. Friends placed flowers at the spot where her body had been found. At Macomb Public Schools, the children she had guided through their days were gently told that their paraeducator would not be coming back. Frank Byers, in the weeks before his arrest, had made public statements proclaiming his innocence and describing how much he missed his wife. Those who had watched his behavior, the text messages to other women, the photographs sent on the day of her funeral, found the performance grotesque. His family received death threats from members of the community who had drawn their own conclusions long before law enforcement drew theirs. The legal process moved with deliberate slowness, as it always does in cases of this magnitude. Michaela's parents, Barbara and Scott Harper, attended every court appearance, refusing to let the system proceed without bearing witness. They wanted Frank Byers to feel the weight of their presence, to understand that however many months might pass, someone would always be in that courtroom representing their daughter. After extensive consultation between the district attorney's office and Michaela's family, a decision was made to accept a guilty plea in exchange for removing the death penalty from the equation. The family considered the offer carefully. A capital trial would mean years of appeals, years of motions and delays and legal maneuvering during which Michaela's death would be relitigated repeatedly, her memory dissected in courtrooms and on news channels for perhaps a decade or more. The plea would mean an end, a certainty. On January 31st, 2025, Frank Allen Cole Byers stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to the murder of his wife, Michaela Faye Meave. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would die behind bars. District Attorney Adam Panter addressed the court and the press, acknowledging that no legal outcome could restore what had been taken, but that the sentence ensured Frank Byers would never again be free to harm anyone. As of today, Frank Byers sits in the custody of the Oklahoma Department of Corrections, 34 years old, with the rest of his life stretching before him inside a cell. Justice, when it finally arrives, does not always feel the way people imagine it will. For Michaela's family, the sentencing brought relief but not peace. Not yet, and perhaps not fully for a long time. Barbara and Scott Harper still believe that Frank Byers did not act entirely alone on the night he moved their daughter's body. They believe someone helped him. Investigators have not closed that chapter of the case. Authorities continue to seek tips about potential accomplices, and federal partners have been called in to assist in extracting encrypted data from one of Byers' phones. The 6 children left behind, Adrian, Brian, Daisy, Lily, Chloe, and Zoe, are children who lost their mother in the most violent and needless way imaginable. They are children who will carry September 15th, 2023, inside them for the rest of their lives. They are children who deserve better, as did the woman who loved them. Lieutenant Dakota Black, who led the investigation that brought Frank Byers to justice, spoke about the case with the weight of someone who carries it still. She said it would stay with her forever. Not only the evidence, not only the investigation, but the portrait of Michaela that emerged through every interview, every photograph, every account from the people who had loved her. A woman who sang when she was happy. A woman who chose to mother children who needed her when her own biology said no. A woman who was walking toward the rest of her life on the last afternoon she was alive. Maybe people will be more aware of what to look for, Black said, and reach out when something feels wrong. In Macomb, Oklahoma, on a quiet stretch of road between Etowah and the edge of town, a small memorial marks the spot where Michaela was found. Flowers left by strangers have weathered through seasons now. The creek still runs below, as creeks do, indifferent and cold. The road carries its traffic as it always has. But the town remembers. The school remembers. The children she taught remember, even if they are too young to fully understand what they lost. And her family, gathering around her memory the way families do, holding photographs, telling stories, saying her name aloud so that it doesn't fade, they remember everything. Michaela Faye Meave was 30 years old. She loved music and animals, and the God she believed was watching over the world. She adopted children who needed a mother, and became exactly that. She worked with struggling students and gave more hours than she was asked to give. She endured a marriage that failed her, found her courage, packed her bags, and chose herself. She deserved to make it out the door. Story 3. The last night of October 2012 fell cold and restless over the small community of Broomfield Township in Isabella County, Michigan. Porch lights glowed amber and orange across the trailer park on Coldwater Road, and children giggled in their costumes, clutching plastic pumpkins filled with candy. Autumn had turned the surrounding woods to rust and gold. It was Halloween, a night meant for make-believe scares, for neighbors trading laughter across fences, for parents watching their little ones toddle up driveways in fairy wings and superhero capes. Inside one of the modest trailers, a young woman named Rebecca Gay tucked her 3-year-old son, Conway, into bed and prepared to rest after a long day. Rebecca was 24 years old, full of quiet warmth and steady purpose. She had grown up in Midland, Michigan, born on March 26, 1988, the daughter of Thomas Gay, a man known and respected in his community as a skilled horseback riding instructor who also organized charity events for the local children's hospital. Growing up in that household of faith, hard work, and compassion, Rebecca absorbed those values deeply. She was a young woman who showed up for people, who loved her son without condition, and who carried herself with a kind of humble dignity that made those around her feel safe. By the time she was 24, she was building a life on her own terms. She lived in the trailer park on Coldwater Road, held down a job, and cared for Conway with fierce, gentle devotion. She had a boyfriend who, on that very Halloween day, had been planning to ask her to marry him. There was so much ahead of her. She could not have known what was coming. She could not have known that just a few trailers away, a man she trusted, a man her own mother was engaged to marry, had spent the past 2 weeks thinking about killing her. His name was John Douglas White. He was 55 years old in the autumn of 2012, and he presented himself to the world as a pastor. He led services at Christ Community Fellowship Church in Deerfield Township, a small congregation where he had positioned himself as a man of God, a man of second chances, a man redeemed. His parishioners knew he had a troubled past, that he had served nearly 12 years in prison for the manslaughter of a 26-year-old woman in Kalamazoo County, released in 2007, but the church elders had given him a second chance. People believed in the power of redemption. What they did not fully grasp was the nature of the man standing at the pulpit. White had not simply made a terrible mistake decades earlier and changed. He had attacked another woman in Calhoun County, a case in which he had entered her home and beaten her, stabbing her near the shoulder blade and delivering blow after blow while attempting to strangle her. Miraculously, she had survived, and during the attack she had heard him say that this was not his first time doing something like this. That case, too, had not resulted in a permanent end to his freedom. He had drifted back into the world, and eventually into the close-knit community of the trailer park on Coldwater Road, where he became the fiancé of Rebecca Gay's mother, and the man who sometimes watched little Conway while Rebecca was at work. Rebecca knew John White. She had no reason to suspect the darkness that lived inside him. He was going to be her stepfather. He had held her child. For 2 weeks before Halloween 2012, John White had been privately nursing a fantasy that most people would not dare name aloud. He had spent days for thinking about killing Rebecca and violating her body after death. He thought about it deliberately with increasing focus. He did not act on an impulse. He planned. On the night of October 30th, rolling into the early hours of October 31st, he drank 4 or 5 beers. Then he gathered what he needed, a rubber mallet, plastic zip ties, construction garbage bags. He walked to Rebecca's trailer. The door was unlocked. White entered while she slept. He attacked her, striking her head repeatedly with the rubber mallet, blow after blow after blow, with a ferocity that was not born from rage or panic, but from premeditation, from something far colder. Rebecca regained consciousness at some point during the attack. She recognized him. According to White's own confession, when he realized she was still alive and had seen his face, he placed a plastic zip tie around her neck and tightened it until she stopped breathing. Conway, 3 years old and dressed for Halloween, was in the trailer the entire time. He was not harmed. Perhaps he slept through it. Perhaps, in the mercy that sometimes spares children from comprehending the worst, he did not understand what was happening. But he was there, and he was alive. White removed Rebecca's clothing from her body and loaded her into his pickup truck along with the mallet and bloody towels. He drove through the sleeping neighborhood to a wooded ravine approximately half a mile from the trailer park and disposed of her body there, hidden among the trees and shadows of an autumn woodland. Forensic examination would later determine that she had been dead for over 24 hours by the time investigators recovered her body. Then John White did something that still strikes those who followed this case as one of the most chilling details in an already devastating story. He drove back to the trailer. He walked back in through the same door. He looked at the little boy whose mother he had just killed, and he dressed Conway in his Halloween costume. The next morning, he took Conway to meet his father, Rebecca's ex-partner, at a nearby Meijer store, as if it were an ordinary handoff, as if nothing at all had happened in the dark hours before dawn. When Rebecca did not show up for work that morning and did not call in, her co-workers noticed immediately. Everyone who knew her understood that this was wrong. Rebecca Gay was responsible and consistent. She did not simply vanish without a word. She did not leave her son without making arrangements. Her boyfriend, who had been carrying an engagement ring and a rehearsed question in his heart, had not heard from her either. The silence from her was unbearable and impossible. Something was deeply, terribly wrong. Police were called. When investigators arrived at the trailer on Coldwater Road, they found Rebecca's purse still sitting inside. But her car, her phone, her wallet, and her keys were all gone. There were other signs too, signs that the trained eyes of law enforcement recognized as indicators of violence, though the full picture was still unclear. Her car was eventually found nearby, staged to suggest she had left on her own. But the purse left behind told a different story. People who intend to leave do not leave their purses. Police set up watch at the trailer and at the location where Rebecca was scheduled to pick up Conway at 4:30 in the afternoon. Her family gathered. Her community rallied. And in the midst of that gathering, one man stood before his congregation at Christ Community Fellowship Church and asked his parishioners to bow their heads and pray for the safe return of Rebecca Gay. That man was John Douglas White. He prayed for her with the congregation. He expressed worry. He performed grief. And in doing so, he sat with the knowledge of exactly where she was, face down in a wooded ravine, half a mile from the trailer where he had killed her. 4:30 p.m. came and went. Rebecca did not come for Conway. She did not come home. She did not answer her phone. As darkness fell again over Isabella County, she was officially declared a missing person, and the search that followed would be one of the most quietly devastating in the area's recent memory. Investigators moved quickly and methodically. On the evening of Halloween itself, a state trooper noticed something that would begin to unravel John White's careful performance. There was blood in the back of his truck. There was also a broken necklace, the kind of small, overlooked detail that criminals seldom anticipate will matter. That was enough for a warrant. When detectives searched White's home and his vehicle, they found what they were looking for: a bag containing a rubber mallet, zip ties, construction garbage bags, and women's underwear. Each item, on its own, might have had an innocent explanation. Together, they told a story. The physical evidence laid out a sequence of events that matched a premeditated, calculated attack. White was brought in for questioning. He initially tried to project cooperation, tried to maintain the persona of the worried neighbor, the concerned future stepfather, the man of God asking his congregation to pray. But when investigators administered a polygraph examination, White failed. The wall came down. John White confessed. He told investigators everything: the 2 weeks of planning, the beers drunk beforehand, the walk to Rebecca's trailer, the unlocked door, the mallet, the zip tie, the moment he realized she was still alive and recognized him. He described stripping her body. He admitted to moving her in his truck, and he led investigators directly to the ravine in the woods where he had left her. Isabella County Sheriff Leo Miodoszewski confirmed the details of the confession at a press conference, describing how White had known Rebecca for some time, had been trusted in her life and her son's life, and had carried out the attack in the early morning hours while Conway slept inside. Rebecca's body was recovered from the ravine. The autopsy conducted in Grand Rapids confirmed the cause of death. She had been beaten and strangled. The ligature marks from the zip tie were visible on her neck. The forensic examination also revealed evidence of sexual assault that had occurred at or near the time of death. The fulfillment, investigators believed, of the fantasy White had described in his confession. She was found with only a shirt and her bra around her neck. On November 1st, 2012, John Douglas White was arraigned in Isabella County Trial Court on charges of first-degree premeditated murder. He was ordered held without bond. The charge carried with it the possibility of life in prison without the chance of parole, a sentence that prosecutors and the community alike felt was appropriate for a man with White's history and the nature of his crime. The case that prosecutor Larry Burdick built was overwhelming. There was White's own detailed confession. There was his direct guidance to Rebecca's body. There was the physical evidence recovered from his home and vehicle, the mallet, the zip ties, the bags. There was the blood in his truck. There was his criminal history, which included the killing of a woman in Kalamazoo County and the brutal assault of a woman in Calhoun County. And there was the chilling detail of his behavior after the crime. The Halloween costume, the Meyer drop-off, the church sermon, the prayer vigil for a woman he had murdered. In March 2013, before the case went to trial, John Douglas White agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to seek a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The plea was accepted. What followed was a sentencing hearing that gave Rebecca's family, her friends, and her community a chance to face the man who had taken her from them, and to speak plainly about what her life had meant and what her loss had cost. Chief Judge Paul Chamberlain, who presided over the hearing in Isabella County Circuit Court, did not accept the sentencing recommendation as it stood. The recommended minimum sentence had been 46 years. Judge Chamberlain added 10 more. John Douglas White was sentenced to 56 years in prison. Given his age at the time of sentencing, it was, for all practical purposes, a life sentence. It was not enough for those who loved Rebecca. It could never be. But it was the law's acknowledgement of the magnitude of what had been done. To her, to Conway, to her mother, to her boyfriend who had carried a ring on the day she died, to her father Thomas, to every person who had sat in a pew praying for a safe return that was never coming. For months after his sentencing, John Douglas White died by suicide in his jail cell. He did not live out the full weight of the sentence handed to him. He chose his own exit, one final exercise of control in a life defined by violence and the assertion of power over others. What remained after John White was gone was not resolution. It was the particular, permanent grief of those left to carry a loss that should never have happened. Rebecca Gay should be alive. By 2026, she would have been 37 years old. Conway, the little boy dressed in his Halloween costume while his mother lay in the woods, would be a teenager. There would have been birthdays and school plays, and probably a wedding she would have attended with the man who had planned to propose to her on October 31st, 2012. There might have been the horses she had loved as a girl, the archery, the quiet, charitable impulses that her father had modeled for her. There would have been more mornings. Instead, she is defined in public record as a case number, a victim, a headline attached to the name of the man who killed her. But for those who knew her, for her son, her family, the co-workers who noticed immediately that her silence was wrong, she was something far more irreducible than any of that. She was a mother who loved her child. She was a daughter of a horse instructor who organized charity events. She was a woman who left the door unlocked because she lived in a neighborhood where she believed she was safe. That belief was not naivety. It was not a mistake. It was the reasonable trust of a person living her life in good faith, surrounded by people she had every reason to think she could rely on. The failure was not hers. It belonged entirely to a man who had been given chance after chance by a system that underestimated his capacity for harm, who slipped through the cracks of consequence more than once, and who used the language and imagery of faith as a mask for something the congregation could not have imagined behind the pulpit. The case of Rebecca Gay endures in public memory, not only because of the horror of the crime or the brazenness of the perpetrator's behavior in its aftermath, but because it raises the kinds of questions that communities find themselves unable to stop asking. How many warnings were missed? How many times had the system encountered John White and allowed him to walk back into the world? What is the cost of misplaced second chances? What happens to the people, the Conways, the mothers, the fathers, when those questions go unanswered too long? There are no clean answers. There is only Rebecca, 24 years old, working hard, raising her son, trusting her neighbors, stepping into a Halloween night that became the last she would ever see. There is Conway, who grew up in the shadow of a night he may not fully remember, but will always carry. There is a community in Isabella County that gathered in grief and prayer and discovered, eventually, that the man leading those prayers already knew the terrible truth they were all searching for. That truth, the depth of that betrayal, is what makes this story not simply a crime narrative, but a human one. It is about who we trust and why, and what it costs when that trust is exploited by the worst kind of person in the most calculated way. It is about a young woman who deserved her future and did not get it. And it is about a little boy who woke up on Halloween morning in a costume his mother would never see him wear, and was carried, by the man who had just killed her, out into an ordinary day that was anything but. Rebecca Gay was 24 years old. She was a mother, a daughter, and a neighbor who left her door unlocked. She deserved to grow old. Story 4. The small city of Russellville, Arkansas sits comfortably in the river valley, cradled between the Ouachita Mountains to the south and the rolling green hills that edge the Arkansas River to the north. It is the kind of place where people still wave from their porches, where college students walk to class in the morning mist, and where December settles in with a quietness that feels like the whole world exhaling. Arkansas Tech University, an institution of roughly 10,000 students, gives the town its heartbeat, and in the winter of 2005, that heartbeat was about to break. Nona Dirksmeyer was 19 years old and 11 days away from her 20th birthday. She was a sophomore at Arkansas Tech, majoring in music education, driven by a deep and genuine love for sound, melody, and the way a well-trained voice could move an entire room. And what a voice she had! A soprano of exquisite clarity, the kind of voice that made people stop talking and simply listen. She had graduated from Dover High School in 2004 and arrived in Russellville with plans as wide as the valley itself. But Nona was not just a musician. She was a young woman who had learned early that she was beautiful, and she had taken that beauty and channeled it into something meaningful. She had won the titles of Pope County Beauty Queen, Miss Teen Nebo, and Miss Petit Jean Valley. She had competed in the Miss Arkansas pageant. Her ambitions, her talent, and her warmth drew people to her naturally, the way a fire draws people in from the cold. She lived in apartment 12 at the Inglewood apartment complex in Russellville, a modest off-campus cluster of units tucked behind everyday streets and shaded parking lots. She had a life to build here. She had exams and rehearsals and friends, and a boyfriend she had known since high school. His name was Kevin Jones, and he had been Nona's sweetheart since their days walking the same hallways in Dover. When Kevin transferred from Arkansas Tech to the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, 90 miles away, the relationship stretched but did not break. They called. They visited. He came back to Russellville when he could, which was exactly what he was doing on the evening of December 15th, 2005. He expected to spend time with her after she finished her final exam. He expected an ordinary evening. He expected, perhaps, to hear about the exam, to eat something together, to simply sit beside her the way people do when they love each other. He did not expect that December 15th, 2005 would be the day that split the rest of his life in two. Through the late afternoon of that Thursday, Kevin tried to reach Nona by phone. She did not pick up. He sent a text message. No reply. Her car was at the apartment. He knew this because her friend confirmed it. The lights inside the apartment were on. But Nona, who had an exam that day, who had plans for that evening, was not answering. Worried, Kevin asked his friend Ryan Whiteside, a pizza delivery driver who knew the area well, to swing by the apartment and check on her. He and his mother Janice were on their way to a party, but the silence from Nona nagged at him with a persistence that was hard to dismiss. Ryan went to the front door of apartment 12 and rang the doorbell. Nothing. He knocked. Still nothing. Kevin and his mother drove over. Kevin knocked again, louder this time, calling her name. The lights were on. Her car was outside. The silence from within was not the silence of someone who had fallen asleep over a textbook. It was a different kind of silence, heavier, more final. Kevin and Ryan walked around to the back of the apartment, to the sliding glass door that opened from the living area. Ryan peered through the glass first. What he saw stopped him cold. Nona was on the floor, motionless, unclothed, lying in the quiet of the apartment she had made her own. The back door was unlocked. Both men went inside. Kevin dropped to his knees beside her and tried CPR, calling her name, pressing his hands to her chest with the desperate urgency of someone who refuses to accept what his eyes are already telling him. When paramedics arrived, they too tried, but Nona Dirksmeyer had been dead for hours. The medical examiner would later confirm it. She was pronounced dead at the scene. She had been stabbed and beaten to death. The base of her own floor lamp had been used as a weapon against her, swung with devastating force. She had been struck repeatedly on her head, her neck, her chest, with a ferocity that spoke not of a robbery gone wrong or a stranger's cold calculation, but of something deeply personal, deeply hateful, and deeply violent. Kevin described finding her as a nightmare, but the nightmare, for him, was only just beginning. The lead detective assigned to the case was a man named Mark Frost. It was his first homicide investigation. He arrived at apartment 12 on the night of December 15th with a team of officers, and the decisions made in those early hours, what to photograph, what to fingerprint, what to bag and tag, what to simply leave, would haunt this case for years. Investigators fingerprinted the area immediately around Nona's body, but they did not fingerprint the front door, despite the fact that there was blood near the entrance. There was also blood on the Venetian blinds, but those were not examined for prints either. The back sliding glass door, which was unlocked, which logic suggested was the exit route the killer had used, was never fingerprinted. The kitchen floor, across which any person leaving through the back door would have had to walk, was never checked for footprints. These were not minor oversights. These were the kind of foundational investigative failures that, once missed, cannot be recovered. In the days that followed, Nona's friends and the people in her orbit were interviewed. Investigators learned that Nona, during the months since Kevin had moved to Fayetteville, had been casually seeing a few other young men. Each of them was questioned. Each provided an alibi. Each was eliminated as a suspect. The investigation's attention slowly, inexorably returned to Kevin Jones, the boyfriend, the person who had found her, the person who had been last known to have contact with her, and the person who, in the eyes of investigators, had the oldest and most complicated emotional connection to the woman lying on that apartment floor. The profiling logic, at its surface, was not without precedent. Young women murdered with such personal intensity, beaten, stabbed, struck repeatedly, are statistically more likely to have been killed by a romantic partner. The crime scene, investigators said, appeared staged. These two factors became the compass bearing around which the investigation oriented itself. Kevin agreed to speak to police on the night they found Nona. He was questioned for hours and then allowed to leave. Weeks later, investigators asked him to take a polygraph examination. Kevin agreed to that too. According to one investigator, Kevin failed the polygraph worse than anyone he had ever tested in 20 years of law enforcement. That assessment, striking as it was not the last word on the matter. An independent expert later examined the polygraph questions and concluded they had been skewed, formulated in a way that almost guaranteed Kevin's failure. It was a finding that raised serious questions about the integrity of the investigation, but it was also a finding that, because polygraph results are generally inadmissible in court, could not carry weight on the floor of a trial. Still, the investigation pressed forward with Kevin Jones as its primary target. On March 31, 2006, 3.5 months after Nona Dirksmeyer was found dead in her apartment, Kevin was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He posted a bond of $250,000 and was released, but the charge and the weight of public suspicion followed him everywhere. The theory the prosecution built was one of jealousy and rage. During the course of their investigation, officers had found a used condom wrapper on the kitchen counter of Nona's apartment. Nona had been found unclothed, but the autopsy showed she had not been raped. Prosecutors theorized that Kevin had arrived at the apartment, seen the condom wrapper, immediately understood that another man had been intimate with Nona, and in a sudden and violent fury, grabbed a knife and then the lamp and attacked her. The bloody palm print found on the light bulb of the floor lamp, the weapon the prosecution believed had been used to crush Nona's skull, was presented as physical evidence that Kevin had held it. Kevin's explanation was simple and human. He had touched the lamp in his frantic, terrified effort to help Nona when he found her. His defense team pointed out that the lamp was found near her body, that in the chaos of discovering the woman he loved lying dead on the floor, it would have been entirely natural to touch it without consciously registering doing so. But the condom wrapper became the most significant battlefield in the trial. The prosecution had never had it tested for DNA or fingerprints. It was Kevin's defense team that requested the analysis. And what the analysis returned was not what the prosecution needed. The fingerprints on the wrapper and the DNA found on it did not belong to Kevin Jones. They belonged to another male, one whose profile did not match anything in the existing law enforcement databases. Kevin's grandmother testified under oath that he had been with her in the town of Dover on the morning of December 15th, during the window that the medical examiner had identified as the time of Nona's death. The foundation beneath the prosecution's case began to crack. After 8 hours of deliberation, in July 2007, a jury returned its verdict. Kevin Jones was found not guilty of the murder of Nona Dirksmeyer. Some in the community exhaled in relief, believing the right outcome had been reached. Others sat with a harder feeling, the conviction, despite the verdict, that justice had somehow still not arrived, that it was either the wrong man freed or the wrong man tried. The case was open again. Nona was still gone, and whoever had killed her had been walking free for more than 1.5 years. 3 months after Kevin's acquittal, in September 2007, a 28-year-old man named Gary Dunn was arrested for burglary in the area. The arrest triggered a protocol, fingerprints and a DNA sample submitted to the laboratory. What the laboratory returned changed the direction of the entire investigation. Gary Dunn had lived in the Inglewood apartment complex at the time of Nona's murder. His apartment sat across the small parking lot from hers, close enough to see her come and go, close enough to notice the lights. He had been briefly questioned and cleared in the original investigation. He had submitted fingerprints and DNA at that time. The results had come back inconclusive, not enough to charge him, not enough to eliminate him entirely. But now, with new samples from his September 2007 arrest, technicians ran a fresh comparison. The DNA on the condom wrapper found on Nona's kitchen counter, the very piece of evidence the prosecution had argued belonged to Kevin Jones, was a suggestive, though not legally conclusive, match to Gary Dunn. The fingerprints on the wrapper were consistent with his as well. The profile that emerged from Gary Dunn's history was deeply alarming. In 2002, 3 years before Nona's murder, Dunn had been walking the Bona Dea Trails Park and Sanctuary, an isolated nature path near Russellville, when he had approached a woman named Kelly Jo Harris from behind. He hit her over the head with a large tree branch, knocking her to the ground. He pinned her down and threatened to kill her. Kelly Jo managed to break free and run toward help. When police arrived, they found Gary Dunn hiding in the water nearby. He was convicted of that attack and served time, 18 months. He was released from prison in 2007. He had been out of prison for only 4 months when he became a suspect in Nona's murder. During the murder investigation, detectives asked Dunn to account for his whereabouts on December 15, 2005. He told them he had been shopping with his mother Martha on that day. Martha corroborated the story. They named the stores. They named the items purchased. But when investigators checked the store records, the receipts told a different story. The items had been bought on December 13th, not the 15th. His alibi had collapsed. There was more. Gary Dunn's ex-wife Jennifer had lived with him in the apartment across the parking lot from Nona's. By the time of his trial, they had divorced, and Jennifer was willing to speak. She told prosecutors that Gary had been violent throughout their marriage. But more specifically, she testified to something that made the courtroom go quiet. In the weeks leading up to Nona's murder, she had found him lurking outside Nona's front door in the middle of the night, and she had caught him looking in through Nona's bedroom window. A new prosecutor, appointed specifically to re-examine the case after Kevin Jones' acquittal, found the suggestive DNA, the collapsed alibi, the prior violent offense, and Jennifer's testimony sufficient to file murder charges. Gary Dunn was charged with the murder of Nona Dirksmeyer. His trial began in April 2010. In the courtroom, the prosecution reconstructed the theory of the crime with Dunn in the role once assigned to Kevin Jones. The state argued that Dunn, driven by a predatory fixation on his beautiful neighbor, had entered her apartment with intent, that he had brought a condom in anticipation of forcing a sexual encounter, that he had pushed through the door and stripped Nona, that she had fought back, and that in subduing her resistance, he had beaten and stabbed her to death. Dunn's defense lawyers fought back on every front. The DNA on the condom wrapper, they argued, was only a mixed partial profile. It could be statistically consistent with thousands, perhaps millions, of men. It was not the kind of certainty on which a murder conviction should rest. Dunn's lawyers also argued that their client had simply misremembered the date of his shopping trip 2 weeks after the fact, that the confusion was human and innocent, and that he had in reality been home in his apartment on December 15th. But the defense's most damaging move was the one that reached back across the courtroom's invisible walls to the man who had already been acquitted. Dunn's lawyers turned the spotlight back on Kevin Jones. They argued that Kevin's statements to the 911 operator, to the paramedics, and to the police had been inconsistent. They noted his admitted use of marijuana, Xanax, and Adderall, and suggested he may have been impaired during a violent confrontation with Nona. They resurrected the condom wrapper theory, that Kevin, upon finding evidence of another man's visit, had snapped, and they leaned into it with deliberate force. Kevin Jones sat in that courtroom as a witness, and was questioned all over again about the night he found his girlfriend dead. The double jeopardy clause of the Fifth Amendment protected him from criminal retrial, but it did not protect him from the public spectacle of being recast as a murderer in another man's defense. It was a different kind of cruelty, experienced in plain view of an audience. The jury deliberated for 3 weeks. They could not agree. The judge declared a mistrial. Prosecutors were not finished. They filed charges again. A second trial for Gary Dunn began in January 2011. This time, the prosecution had been granted permission to introduce Kelly Jo Harris's testimony about the 2002 trail attack, evidence of Dunn's willingness to ambush a woman in an isolated space, to pin her down and threaten her life. It was the kind of prior pattern evidence that prosecutors had hoped would break through the jury's doubt. But Dunn's defense team mounted the same arguments, attacked the same DNA, pointed back again at Kevin Jones, and left the jury in the same place. 3 weeks of deliberation, another hung jury, another mistrial. The state of Arkansas, having now spent years and enormous resources on 2 trials that each ended without a verdict, faced a stark reality. The evidence against Gary Dunn was suggestive, circumstantial, and emotionally compelling, but the legal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt had proven impossible to meet in front of 2 separate juries. Prosecutors declined to seek a third trial. Gary Dunn walked free. Nona Dirksmeyer's family had watched the entire arc of this case unfold across more than half a decade. They had sat through Kevin's trial and acquittal. They had watched with cautious hope as Gary Dunn was charged. They had attended 2 trials, sat through weeks of testimony and cross-examination, been put through the grinding machinery of a legal system that could not seem to reach a conclusion about who had ended their daughter's life. And then they watched as the man most believed to be responsible was released and disappeared back into the world. There was no resolution. There was only absence. Kevin Jones, for his part, rebuilt his life with a determination that impressed those who watched him do it. He became an attorney. He returned to Russellville and began practicing law there, in the very city where he had once been publicly accused of killing the woman he loved. He filed a civil lawsuit against former Detective Mark Frost, former Police Chief James Bacon, and the city of Russellville, alleging that they had deliberately concealed evidence that pointed to his innocence. Specifically, portions of Frost's own handwritten field notes that implicated Dunn and should have been disclosed to the prosecutor during Kevin's original trial. The lawsuit was ultimately dismissed on the grounds that the claims were barred by statutes of limitations, a ruling that an appeals court upheld in October 2014. The system had failed Kevin Jones as both a defendant and a plaintiff. He absorbed both failures and kept moving. Mark Frost, the first-time homicide detective who had led the initial investigation, who had failed to fingerprint the back door, who had not examined the Venetian blinds for prints, who had stood accused of concealing his own notes, was eventually promoted. By the time the lawsuits were resolved, he had become a captain and assistant police chief in Dardanelle, Arkansas. The world kept turning. Then, in December 2018, something happened that sent a cold shiver through everyone who had followed this case. Gary Dunn had been sentenced in 2017 to 10 years in prison on a firearms offense. He served just 1 year. He was paroled in August 2018. He had been out of prison for 4 months, exactly 4 months, mirroring with eerie precision the gap between his release from prison in 2007 and the re-examination of his DNA in connection with Nona's murder, when he struck again. On the evening of December 4th, 2018, the Russellville Police Department and the Arkansas Tech University Office of Public Safety received separate reports from several women about 2 disturbing incidents that had occurred within 20 minutes of each other. In the first, Gary Dunn had followed a young Arkansas Tech student named Riley Wagner as she was driving and had blocked her from pulling out of a parking space. He got out of his vehicle and attempted to force his way into hers, pulling at the door. Riley managed to lock the door before he could open it. When she raised her phone to call 911, Dunn fled. 20 minutes later, he tried again. Another woman. Another attempt to force entry into a vehicle. When police issued a bulletin describing the suspect's car, officers in nearby Dardanelle stopped a vehicle matching the description. It was Gary Dunn. In his vehicle, police found ropes and knives. He was arrested. His parole was immediately violated. He was transported to state custody and eventually back to Pope County to face new charges. In November 2019, Gary Dunn accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted kidnapping, with 10 years of that sentence suspended, meaning he would need to serve at least 30% before becoming parole eligible. Riley Wagner, the young Arkansas Tech student whose locked car door had likely saved her life on the night Gary Dunn returned to the streets of Russellville, went on to compete in the Miss Arkansas pageant. In 2022, she was crowned Miss Arkansas. In the years between the attack and that crown, she carried the weight of knowing exactly how close the darkness had come and how narrowly it had passed. The murder of Nona Dirksmeyer remains, officially, an open and unsolved case. No one has ever been convicted of ending her life on December 15, 2005. The floor of apartment 12 at the Inglewood complex has been cleaned and repainted and lived in by someone else. The lamp is gone. The kitchen counter where a condom wrapper sat and silently held the answer to the whole terrible mystery has been wiped down 1,000 times. 2 suspects were charged. 3 trials were held. 2 juries could not agree on a verdict. 1 jury acquitted an innocent man. The legal machinery of the state of Arkansas spent years and millions of dollars and the emotional reserves of a grieving family and came away with nothing to show for it, except for the growing understanding, held quietly by most people who studied the case closely, of who probably walked through Nona Dirksmeyer's unlocked back door on a December morning in 2005. The lead detective on the case concealed his own field notes. The man widely believed to be the killer walked out of two mistrials. The boyfriend who had nothing to do with it was dragged through years of suspicion and a public trial that branded him in the memory of a community, before going on to become a lawyer, because what else do you do when the law has failed you? You learn it. And Nona herself, the 19-year-old with the soprano voice and the beauty queen titles and the plans for a life in music education, who was 11 days from her 20th birthday when she was taken, has been reduced in the public record to the terms the legal system assigns. Victim, case number, open file. Her family has been left to hold the rest of her. What happened to Nona Dirksmeyer is a story about violence, yes. But it is also a story about every way a system can fail a young woman before and after she is killed. It is about a first-time homicide detective who chose what to fingerprint and what to leave untouched. It is about prosecutors who focused so narrowly on the obvious suspect that they walked past the dangerous man living across the parking lot. It is about two juries brought to the edge of certainty and pulled back by doubt. The very doubt that the system requires, because the alternative is worse, but which in this case left a killer free and a family without answers for nearly 2 decades and counting. It is above all about Nona, talented, warm, beautiful, full of music and gone. 11 days from her birthday. One locked back door away from a different story entirely. Story 5. August in Henry County, Virginia, arrives with a particular kind of heaviness, a thick, humid heat that settles over the countryside like a slow exhale. The farmland and woodland around the small community of Oak Level, nestled about 60 miles north of Greensboro, North Carolina, sits quietly in that heat, framed by country roads and the kind of ordinary rural geography where people tend to know their neighbors' names and leave their doors unlocked because this is, they believe, the sort of place where nothing truly terrible ever happens. In the summer of 2002, a family lived in that belief. Michael Short was 50 years old, a physically capable man who had spent years building a business with his hands. His company, MS Mobile Home Movers, was the kind of modest, local enterprise that keeps small American communities functioning, moving and positioning mobile homes across the region for families who needed them set and ready to live in. He was a man of labor and routine. In the evenings, he would often retreat to the garage, where he kept a couch and a television, and simply unwind in that way working men often do. Not in silence, but in the particular comfort of familiar noise and earned rest. His wife, Mary, was 36 years old. 14 years younger than her husband, she was the heart of the home in the way that certain people simply are, present, warm, and steady. Theirs was a life built on work and family, without pretension or flourish. And then there was Jennifer, 9 years old, born with the particular energy of a child who had not yet learned to dim herself for the world's convenience. She played softball. She danced. She attended church and birthday parties, and moved through her days with the unguarded openness of a little girl who had every reason to trust the people around her. Her neighbors watched her play in the yard. People in the community knew her face. She was the kind of child who made places feel alive just by being in them. The Shorts were, by every account, an ordinary family, not wealthy, not powerful, not entangled in anything that would mark them as targets. Michael had been exploring the possibility of relocating the family to South Carolina. In the spring and summer of 2002, he had made several trips south, to Bennettsville, Florence, Conway, and Myrtle Beach, scouting for work, looking for somewhere to set down new roots. He was a man in the process of planning his family's future. He had blank checks and $60 in cash in the house. He had a .22 caliber shotgun. He had a life not yet finished. Nobody in Oak Level could have imagined what the morning of August 15th, 2002 would bring. The first person to arrive at the Short home that morning was one of Michael's employees, a man who had come to start work, to begin an ordinary Thursday the way an ordinary Thursday begins, with the quiet sounds of a job being set in motion. What he found instead was not ordinary at all. Michael Short was lying on the couch in the garage. The television may still have been on. He was dead. A single bullet had been fired into his head, placed with a precision that investigators would later describe as deliberate and controlled, execution style, in the clinical language that law enforcement uses to describe murders committed with the kind of calm efficiency that suggests experience, or at least premeditation. The employee called for help. When sheriff's deputies entered the house itself, they found Mary Short in her bedroom, dead in the same way, a single gunshot wound to the head. Her mattress had been moved 2 inches from its normal position. Her pillow lay on the bedroom floor. These small displacements suggested a struggle, or at least a disturbance, before or after her death, that someone had reached across her or moved around her in the dark hours of that Virginia night. And Jennifer was gone. The child's absence was, in those first moments of discovery, the detail that shifted everything. 2 parents dead in separate rooms, shot with the same kind of cold efficiency. A 9-year-old daughter not in her bed, not in the house, not anywhere visible on the property. The immediate and terrible question, the one that seized every investigator and every neighbor and every parent in a 50-mile radius, was whether Jennifer had somehow escaped or whether she had been taken. There was something else. The phone lines to the Short home had been cut. Not accidentally severed, not down by whether or where, deliberately cut by someone who understood that functional phone lines meant the possibility of a call for help, and who had planned in advance to eliminate that possibility. That single detail, the cut phone line, told investigators everything they needed to know about the kind of person they were looking for. Not someone who had stumbled into violence, not someone overwhelmed by impulse, but someone who had thought about this beforehand. Someone who had stood outside this family's home in the dark and made preparations. An Amber Alert was issued. Law enforcement from Henry County, the Virginia State Police, the FBI, and eventually departments across 2 states began one of the most intensive searches in the region's recent memory. Jennifer Short's photograph was circulated. Tips flooded in. Volunteers gathered. The community of Oak Level, shaken and disbelieving, showed up with the desperate energy that communities summon when there is still a chance. When a child is missing rather than confirmed dead, and hope is not yet a past tense. The days that followed were defined by a terrible, expanding silence. Jennifer did not appear. No credible sighting was reported. The leads that arrived were pursued, tested, and discarded one by one. Investigators worked through the oppressive late summer heat of Virginia and the Carolinas, conducting interviews, following routes, checking locations where a missing child might be. The community of Bassett and Oak Level held its breath for 6 weeks. Then, on September 25, 2002, a man walking in Stoneville, North Carolina, a small community in Rockingham County, about 30 miles south of the Short family home, noticed that his dogs had found something. The dogs had brought back what appeared initially to be a turtle shell. A closer look revealed it was not a turtle shell at all. The Albert family, who lived nearby on the property along Gordon Road near a small stream, found human teeth in their driveway. They were Jennifer Short's remains. 6 weeks of searching, of holding on to the thread of possibility, ended in a North Carolina creek bank. The skeletal remains were confirmed through forensic analysis to be Jennifer's. She had been shot in the head, the same way her parents had been killed. She had been transported from Virginia to North Carolina, roughly 30 to 40 miles, by whoever had taken her from the house on the night of August 14th into the early morning of August 15th. The question of why she had been taken, why the killer or killers had not simply left her in the house, became one of the most haunting dimensions of the entire investigation. She had been moved. She had been carried, driven, transported. She had been alive or dead during that journey, and no one knew which. The geography of where she was found told investigators that whoever had done this knew the land well enough to travel south across the Virginia-North Carolina line and dispose of a child's body in a location remote enough that it took 6 weeks, and a dog's random discovery to find her. Henry County's longest-running homicide investigation had officially begun. The evidence gathered from the Short home was extensive. 66 boxes of items with possible evidentiary value were removed from the property. Shell casings, the family shotgun, documents, personal effects, financial records, the couple's blank checks. Investigators combed through every corner of that house looking for the thread that would lead them to a killer, or killers, with the cold efficiency who had walked in armed, killed 2 adults in separate rooms without apparent alarm between them, and then left with a 9-year-old girl. From the beginning, the motive refused to become clear. Michael Short's mobile home business was modest. He was not a man of great wealth or dangerous enemies in any obvious sense. The cash in the house, $60, had not been taken. The blank checks had not been used. There was no sign of a robbery. Nothing of visible value appeared to be missing. Investigators turned to the possibility that the family had been targeted specifically. Michael's business involved migrant workers paid on a cash basis, people who moved in and out of his employment without formal records, some of whom could not be tracked through standard channels. It also involved relationships with mobile home dealers, contractors, transporters, and salvage yard owners across a wide region of Southern Virginia and the Carolinas. Any one of these relationships, stretching back over the years, could have generated a grievance, a debt, a resentment deep enough to drive someone to Oak Level with a gun and a plan. The most persistent and chilling early theory was the one that Sheriff Lane Perry would eventually articulate publicly in 2015, that Jennifer Short may have been the primary target, that the parents had been killed not as the main event, but as obstacles, people who stood between a predator and the child he had come for. This theory, spoken aloud at a press conference more than a decade after the murders, hit the community of Henry County like a physical blow. It suggested that someone had watched Jennifer, had fixated on her, had spent time in the orbit of her softball games and church events and birthday parties, and had eventually come for her in the night. If that was true, then the killer was not a stranger in the way investigators initially might have imagined. A person who targets a specific child does so after observation. They know the child's schedule, her address, her routine, the layout of where she lives. They have been present in her world, perhaps without anyone realizing it. In 2009, 7 years after the murders, the FBI took a significant investigative step and released a composite sketch. The sketch depicted a man described as having a weathered complexion, appearing to be in his 40s, who had been observed by a witness sitting in a white, single-cab, 2-ton flatbed state body truck with wooden rails along U.S. Highway 220. The road running past the Short family's property, during the early morning hours of August 15, 2002. He had been sitting there in the dark in a vehicle near the house of a family that would be found dead hours later. The FBI's composite sketch and vehicle description were distributed widely. An age-progressed version was later generated and released, accounting for the years that had passed. The truck was described in enough detail that investigators believed someone, somewhere, would recognize it. A 1998 to 2002 white International flatbed, cab similar in appearance to a 4500 series. It was a specific, identifiable vehicle. It was not invisible. No one came forward with the name of the man in the truck. Investigators also followed a thread that led north, and then very far away. A 60-year-old man described as a material witness, not named publicly as a suspect, had left North Carolina for the Northwest Territories of Canada on August 16, 2002, the day after the murders were discovered. That single-day departure, timed with an exactness that made investigators sit up straight, was pursued as a line of inquiry. The trail was followed. Documents were reviewed. The man was located, but the investigation of that lead did not result in criminal charges, and investigators declined to elaborate on what they found or didn't find. A person of interest named Garrison Bowman was at one point examined closely enough to become part of the public conversation around the case. By the time investigators had worked through his alibi, he was exonerated, cleared not because investigators lost interest, but because the alibi held. The details of what exonerated him were not publicly disclosed, and that silence, like so many silences in this case, left the community to fill in the space with its own interpretations. Through the 2000s and into the 2010s, the investigation continued, slowly, with the grinding, methodical pace that cold cases impose on the people who work them. The Henry County Sheriff's Office built a task force. The FBI remained involved. The Virginia State Police contributed resources. In 2021, Sheriff Lane Perry assembled a multi-agency task force specifically to re-examine the physical evidence with new scientific eyes, including the advanced DNA testing technologies that had not existed in 2002 and that had, in the intervening years, solved cases that once seemed permanently closed. In 2022, 20 years after the murders, Perry announced that the county had been awarded a grant to fund enhanced scientific testing on the 66 boxes of evidence collected from the Short home. Every item, every casing, every surface that might carry biological material would be subjected to the most current forensic analysis available. Any advancement that could possibly break something will be done, Perry said publicly. The task force's work drew people into the story who had not previously been part of it. Investigators from multiple jurisdictions, federal agents, forensic specialists. The U.S. Attorney's Office became involved. The message being sent was unmistakable. This case was not forgotten, and it was not going to be quietly shelved. Each summer, a group of motorcyclists made the ride from Henry County, Virginia, to Rockingham County, North Carolina, tracing in daylight the route the killer had likely driven in darkness more than 2 decades earlier. The ride was organized for years by Ray Reynolds, a former neighbor of the Shorts, who had made a promise to himself and to the community that he would keep going until someone was brought to justice. Reynolds, aging and dealing with health issues that eventually forced him to step back, spoke about the rides with a grief that had not softened with time. "I made a promise I'd continue to do this until someone was brought to justice," he said, "and it just breaks my heart that this has not been solved. If any of you have kids, love your kids all you can. Just think about what the Short family's been through, and what happened to that little girl." A scholarship in Jennifer Short's name was established and funded through the proceeds of those rides. The child who never made it to her 10th birthday was remembered, year after year, by people who had watched her play in the yard, who could still see her in the specific way neighbors see children. The particular image of small feet in the grass outside a house that no longer stands. Because the house is gone too. In February 2019, 16 years after the murders, the Short family home on Virginia Avenue in Bassett burned to the ground. The cause was never definitively explained. For the neighbors who had been watching it all those years, driving past it, carrying the memory of the family that had lived there, the fire felt like another loss layered on top of the first one. When you drive by and look at the house, you see memories of the little girl running around the house, Ray Reynolds said when the house burned. She was always outside playing. Now there was nothing left to look at. Just a lot, a cleared space, a patch of Virginia ground that still holds its secret. As of August 2025, 23 years after the night that shattered the Short family, the case remains officially unsolved. No arrests have been made. No charges have been filed. The man in the white flatbed truck who sat on U.S. Highway 220 in the pre-dawn darkness of August 15, 2002, watching the house where a family slept, or watching for signs of movement in a house he had already visited, has never been publicly identified. The person or persons who cut the phone lines, killed Michael and Mary Short in separate rooms with methodical precision, took a 9-year-old girl from her bed, drove 30 miles south into North Carolina, and left her along a creek bank under the summer sky. They remain free. The FBI tip line is still active. Investigators still accept new leads. The task force still meets. The evidence boxes still exist, all 66 of them, now being tested with tools that did not exist when they were first collected. What is known can be assembled into the skeleton of a night. The cut phone line placed before the attack, The execution-style precision of 2 separate shootings in 2 separate rooms, the decision to take Jennifer rather than leave her, the white flatbed truck parked on the highway in the dark, the 30-mile drive to North Carolina, and 6 weeks of the August Virginia heat before a dog found what remained of a 9-year-old girl. What is not known is everything that gives those facts meaning. The face, the name, the motive, the connection to the family, the specific thread. Whether it ran through Michael's business, through someone who had watched Jennifer, through a debt or a grievance or a fixation that the Short family never knew existed, that led a killer to that house. The community of Henry County has lived with both pieces for 23 years. The known facts and the unbearable gap of the unknown, sitting side by side in the silence of a rural Virginia August that never quite ended. Jennifer's softball teams, Mary's bedroom with the moved mattress and the pillow on the floor, Michael's couch in the garage, the television still on. 3 people, 1 family, 1 night, and somewhere living with the knowledge of what happened. Perhaps still in the South Piedmont region of Virginia, perhaps across a state line in the Carolinas, perhaps in the Northwest Territories of Canada, perhaps closer to home than anyone in Oak Level wants to imagine. The person who knows the answer to the question that has outlasted a house, outlasted 2 decades of leads, and outlasted the formal mechanisms of justice without ever being answered. Who killed the Short family? Who took Jennifer? The creek in Stoneville knows. The white flatbed truck knows. The cut phone line, strung beside a house that no longer stands on a Virginia road that still carries the name of the place where 3 people used to live, knows. Everything else is waiting. Story 6. The house on Apollo Way sat in a quiet corner of Mount Olive, New Jersey, a modest, pleasant home on a tree-lined street in Morris County, where the pace of life moved slowly and neighbors rarely had cause for alarm. It was the kind of home that spoke of middle-class stability, a front door flanked by a glass storm door, a staircase rising from a carpeted foyer, a bedroom where ordinary things were tucked beneath mattresses. On the evening of March 3, 2014, 3 gunshots cracked through that quiet house, and when the sound died away, a man lay bleeding on the floor near the front door, and a woman sat in the dark upstairs, listening to her own breathing. What came next, the lies, the investigation, the courtroom, the verdict, would take years to untangle. But the question at the center of everything was simple and terrible. Was this murder, or was it survival? Virginia Vertitas had spent most of her life searching for the thing she wanted most, a stable, loving relationship that would not eventually crumble beneath her. By the time she met Patrick Gilhuley in 2008, she had already been married 3 times and had known more heartbreak than most people encounter in a lifetime. She had grown up in a household shaped by her mother, Cranny Koelhofer, a woman who watched her daughter closely and worried often. Virginia was bright, eventually earning a master's degree and working toward a doctorate. She had left a well-paying corporate position at AT&T to become a schoolteacher, not for the salary, but because it allowed her to be home for her 2 children, Kelly and Billy, after school. Those who knew her during those years described her as a devoted, loving mother who put her children before everything else. Her second marriage, to Scott Vertitas, also a police officer, had been the one she had poured the most of herself into, the one she had believed in with the particular intensity of someone who wants desperately to get something right. When Scott was unfaithful and the marriage collapsed, the impact on Virginia was profound. Her third marriage, to a man named Jim Faulkner, whom she had also met online, was turbulent and short-lived. Faulkner later told investigators and a jury that whenever he tried to leave, Virginia begged him to come back, once sending him 100 roses. He described a woman who, underneath the intelligence and capability, was deeply afraid of being alone. When that marriage ended, Virginia found herself back where she had started, alone, lonely, and on Match.com. Patrick Gilhuley found her profile in 2008, and something clicked. He was 51 years old, a retired New York Police Department officer who had gone on to work in private security, including a celebrated stint as a bodyguard for Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. He He was broad-shouldered and gregarious, the kind of man who filled a room. A man with a big laugh and two daughters he adored, Jennifer and Heather. He was also, as everyone who knew him eventually acknowledged, complicated. He drank heavily. He was prone to jealousy. He had a history that included a domestic violence incident with his first wife years earlier, charges that were filed and then dropped. Prosecutor Matt Toronto, who would later argue the case against Virginia, was candid about this in court. Patrick, he told the jury, was not perfect. He drank too much and too often. But he had a big heart, and he was loved. Virginia fell for Patrick hard, and in the early months of their relationship, the connection felt real. But the relationship was almost immediately unsteady. They broke up and reconciled so many times over the next 5 years that Virginia later told the jury she could not even count the number of separations. They argued about his drinking, about his jealousy, about his attitude toward other men who spoke to her. Virginia said he was physically violent with her on multiple occasions, pushing her into walls, throwing her to the floor, shoving her onto a bed. Her mother said she saw bruises. Virginia never reported any of it to police. If she ever reported him, the police would not believe her. He was a cop. He knew those people. In Virginia's mind, shaped by years of alleged abuse and already burdened by an autoimmune illness that had pulled her off work 3 months earlier, these warnings had calcified into something close to truth. She believed it, and so she stayed quiet, kept returning to the relationship when it fractured, kept hoping that the man she loved would become, permanently, the man he sometimes was. By the winter of 2014, the relationship had entered what would prove to be its final, most volatile chapter. Virginia was on disability leave from her teaching position at Wharton Elementary School, struggling with an autoimmune disease that left her physically depleted. She had petitioned the school board to return to work, and in the weeks before March 3rd, she received the answer she had been dreading. The board voted no. The job she had loved, the career she had built to stay close to her children, the routine that had given her days shape and purpose, all of it suddenly out of reach. And then there was Colleen Roper. In early February 2014, Virginia discovered that Patrick had been seeing another woman, a woman named Colleen Roper, who had been told by Patrick that Virginia was merely an ex-girlfriend. Virginia sent her prank calls. She sent her Facebook messages. When Roper replied, insisting she had done nothing wrong since she believed the relationship was over, Virginia fired back that she had been with Patrick that very morning. Patrick was furious. He broke up with Virginia by text on February 4th, his message blunt and final. "We are done. So done. Wish you luck. Find someone else. You can do it. Good luck." But endings in this relationship never seemed to hold. Virginia reached out again. She told Patrick she had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a claim she would later admit to the jury was not entirely accurate. She used the illness to appeal to his sympathy, to keep him close. She sent him texts that, when read aloud in a courtroom months later, were painfully revealing of how desperate she had become to hold on to him. The prosecution used these messages to build their portrait of a woman consumed by obsession, a woman who, when Patrick finally decided to walk away for good, chose not to let him go. Patrick Gilhuley arrived at Virginia's house on the evening of March 3rd, 2014, somewhere around 6:30, having come over after Virginia texted to ask if he was coming, to have a final conversation about their relationship and about an IRS tax matter that had been causing him significant anxiety. Virginia had apparently filled out a form to notify the IRS about Patrick's years of unpaid taxes, a detail that Patrick had discovered and that the defense believed was the match that lit the explosion. What happened inside that house over the next hour or so is the event that two legal narratives would fight to define. The evening began badly and spiraled quickly. After an attempted moment of intimacy that failed, Patrick's mood darkened. At some point, Virginia left briefly to get firewood from a nearby convenience store, and when she returned she found Patrick gone. He called her angrily, demanding to know why she had left without telling him. She calmed him down and convinced him to come back. When he returned, he was drunk, Blood alcohol testing would later reveal that Patrick Gilhuly's alcohol level that evening was nearly 3 times the legal driving limit. He came through the storm door in a rage. Virginia said she heard the glass shatter. As he slammed it, they argued. Things escalated. He grabbed her by the throat in the foyer, pressed her against the front door, and looked her directly in the eyes. "I'm going to kill you," he told her. She believed him. She tore herself away and ran up the stairs to her bedroom. She reached under the mattress and found the .38 caliber revolver that Patrick had left there years ago, back in the spring of 2012. A gun he had left because she didn't like being alone, because she was afraid. She grabbed it. She came to the bedroom doorway. She aimed it toward the staircase, and she fired. 3 shots. Then silence. Patrick Gilhuly was found by responding officers just inside the front door. He was shot multiple times, including wounds to his hand, neck, arm, and back. He was dead. Virginia called 911 25 minutes after the shooting. And when she called, she told a lie. "Somebody was breaking into my house," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't know who was coming in. I was in bed. Nobody had been breaking into her house." She had known exactly who was there. The lie on the 911 call became one of the most damaging elements of Virginia's case from the moment investigators began working the scene. Officers who arrived found Patrick's body near the door. They found Virginia's bedroom shower still warm and wet. They found a pair of pink pajama pants spinning inside a running washing machine. And they found Patrick's cell phone resting inside the pocket of his jeans, a detail that would generate one of the most gripping debates of the subsequent trial. Patrick had made 6 phone calls in the 4 minutes before he was shot. 3 of them went to his daughter Jennifer. The other 3 went to friends. Jennifer Gilhuly described what she heard during those calls with a composure that kept fracturing under the weight of what she was saying. She heard her father screaming that she was hitting him. She heard him telling her to stop. She heard the line go quiet and then fill with gunfire. "She's shooting," he managed to say. And then the call went dead. It was the last time Jennifer Gilhuly ever spoke to her father. The prosecution's theory was straightforward and devastating in its simplicity. Virginia Vertitis had been unable to accept that Patrick Gilhuly was leaving her. She had isolated herself from her job, was struggling with her health, had lost daily contact with her son Billy, and was on the verge of losing the one relationship that had defined her emotional life for 6 years. On the night of March 3rd, she had not been defending herself. She had been attacking him. The phone calls he made were his desperate attempts to tell someone what was happening before it was too late. The prosecution argued that Patrick's phone had ended up in his pocket not because he had placed it there, but because Virginia had placed it there during the 25 minutes between the shooting and the 911 call, staging the scene to match the story she intended to tell. They believed she had scratched her own arms in the interrogation room, where she was held for 13 hours without giving a formal statement, manufacturing evidence of a struggle that never happened. Interrogation room footage, which would later be shown to the jury, appeared to show Virginia making scratching motions on her arms during the long hours she sat alone. And then there was the glass storm door. Virginia's account required the storm door to have already been shattered by Patrick in his fury before the shooting began. But when forensic expert Howard Ryan examined the bullet hole in the door, he found something that flatly contradicted that timeline. When a bullet passes through intact glass, it produces radiating fracture lines that spread outward from the point of impact, a distinctive physical signature. When a bullet passes through glass that is already broken, no such lines form. The storm door at Virginia's house showed clear radial fracture lines emanating from the bullet hole. The glass had been intact when the bullet went through it. The glass had not been broken before the shooting. Patrick had not shattered it in rage. The door had been broken by the gunfire itself. It was a quiet, precise piece of evidence, but its implications were enormous. It meant that a central element of Virginia's story, the enraged ex-boyfriend who smashed the door on his way in, could not have happened the way she described. The defense pushed back at every turn. Ed Bylinkes, Virginia's lead attorney, was relentless and impassioned. He called legendary forensic pathologist Dr. Cyril Wecht, a man whose career had included the Kennedy assassination and the death of Elvis Presley, to analyze the wound on Patrick's right hand. Wecht concluded that the Gray's wound suggested Patrick's hand had been raised upward toward Virginia, consistent with her account of him reaching toward her as he came up the stairs. The prosecution countered that Patrick's hand had been raised because he was holding his phone to his ear when the bullet passed close by, and that Virginia had then placed the phone back into his pocket before calling 911. As for the scratches on Virginia's arms, Valinkes asked the jury a pointed question. What about the injury to her throat? If Virginia had inflicted every mark on herself, how did she acquire the injuries at her neck? He argued that a man of Patrick's size and strength, genuinely attacking Virginia with the intent to kill, would not necessarily have left catastrophic marks on a woman he choked. That the absence of severe bruising was not evidence that nothing happened, only evidence of how physical violence works in the real world. And then, late in the trial, as the case appeared to be slipping from the defense's grasp, a piece of evidence emerged from an unexpected direction. Patrick's car key fob had been found broken apart inside Virginia's house, the components scattered in different locations. The defense had pointed to this as evidence of a violent struggle. People do not casually disassemble car key fobs. But the prosecution offered a darker interpretation. During closing arguments, Valinkes had rhetorically asked the jury who had broken the fob. Prosecutor Troiano seized the opening. If Virginia had broken the fob and scattered its pieces, he told the jury, she had done so with a specific purpose. Patrick could not start his car. He could not drive away. He was trapped. And that was why he made 6 increasingly desperate phone calls in 4 minutes before he died. The jury took that argument into the deliberation room, and they took the fob with them. In a moment that would later be described outside the courtroom, the jurors laid all the pieces out on the table and discovered something remarkable. Not a single piece was actually broken. The fob had been taken apart, methodically and completely, right down to the battery. It had not been shattered in a struggle. It had been disassembled, and then scattered to look like it had been shattered. After nearly 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on first-degree murder. The sentencing, held 2 months after the verdict in 2017, carried the full weight of every life that had been altered by what happened on Apollo Way. Patrick's brother Paul stood before the judge and described a man whose daughters would now face every milestone of their lives, weddings, birthdays, Father's Days, without him beside them. Patrick's ex-wife Teresa, the mother of Jennifer and Heather, read the girl's statement aloud, her voice breaking under words that her daughters had written from the deepest part of their grief. Their father would never hear them say, "I love you, Daddy," again. The judge sentenced Virginia Vertitis to 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. In the gallery, Virginia's mother, Craney, sat with the stunned expression of a woman watching a future she had dreaded become real. She had watched her daughter's marriage fall apart, had seen the bruises she said she observed on Virginia's arms and legs, had pleaded with Virginia to leave the relationship long before March 3rd ever arrived. Now she was watching that same daughter be led away to spend what could be the rest of her life in a cell. "One of the things she keeps telling me is, 'Mom, don't leave me,'" Craney said afterward, her eyes full of tears. "And I hope I don't have to before she gets out." The legal story did not end with that sentencing. In 2020, the New Jersey Appellate Division overturned Virginia's murder conviction, concluding that the jury had been given incorrect instructions about the state's self-defense law, specifically the legal doctrine known as the Castle Doctrine, which addresses a person's right to use force to defend themselves within their own home. The appellate court determined that Virginia had been entitled to a proper instruction on this principle, and that the failure to provide it may have affected the jury's verdict. A new trial was ordered. Rather than face a second full murder trial, Virginia Vertitis entered a guilty plea in 2021 to the lesser charge of aggravated manslaughter, a legal acknowledgement that a killing occurred, but without the element of intent required for first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but that sentence, too, was eventually challenged. An appellate court found in 2023 that the judge who had imposed the 20-year term had relied on aggravating factors that were not properly supported by the evidence. The sentence was vacated once more. In June 2024, Virginia Vertitis appeared before a new judge in Morris County and received what has so far been her final sentence, 18 years in prison. Under New Jersey sentencing law, she is required to serve 85% of that term, roughly 15 years and 3 months, before becoming eligible for release. She has been given credit for the years she has already spent incarcerated. As of today, she remains in the custody of the New Jersey state prison system. What the case of Virginia Vertitis leaves behind is not a simple story. It never was. It is a story about a woman who spent decades searching for love and consistently found volatility instead. A woman who had, by multiple accounts including her own mother's, been subjected to physical abuse by a man who had also been disciplined for striking his first wife. It is also a story about a man who made 6 panic phone calls to his daughter in the final minutes of his life, who according to witnesses sounded terrified, who had told his brother that very day that he was finally ready to leave for good. It is a story about what happens when a complicated, painful relationship reaches its breaking point, and the only surviving witness lies to the police about what she did. It is a story about forensic evidence, about fracture lines and shattered glass, about a phone found tucked into a dead man's pocket, about a car key fob disassembled and scattered, about 25 minutes of silence before a 911 call was made. Patrick Gilhuly's daughters, Jennifer and Heather, have carried the weight of their father's death through every year since 2014. Jennifer heard his last words spoken into a phone call she could not end. Heather sat through the trial and, in the middle of testimony, realized she had a photograph on her phone that could matter, and she made the call that night to tell the prosecutor. These are not the actions of people who have been able to move past what happened. They are the actions of daughters who have never been able to stop fighting for their father's name. And Virginia's mother, Craney, now in the years of her life when she should have been at peace, has spent them advocating for a daughter she loves absolutely, hoping to live long enough to see her walk out free. The house on Apollo Way has long since moved on. The storm door that held such critical evidence is gone, replaced by the quiet ordinariness of a neighborhood street that carries no visible trace of what happened behind its walls one March evening. But the people shaped by those 3 gunshots, Jennifer and Heather Gilhuly, Craney Koelhofer, the jurors who assembled pieces of a key fob on a deliberation room table, the attorneys who carried the weight of the case home with them at night, all of them carry something from that house that has never entirely left. In the end, the court decided what could be legally proven, that Virginia Vertitis killed Patrick Gilhuly, and that the killing constituted aggravated manslaughter. What the court could not fully resolve, what no verdict can ever entirely resolve, is the human question underneath the legal one. What 2 people, caught inside a relationship that had been hurting both of them for years, were truly capable of doing to each other on the night it finally, irreversibly, came to an end. Story 7. The autumn sun filtered through the windows of the Battery Park City apartment on the afternoon of September 10, 2001, casting gentle shadows across the orchids that Sneha and Philip carefully tended. At 31 years old, she had the kind of beauty that turned heads, but it was her mind that had carried her from the southern coast of India to the hallways of Johns Hopkins University, through the rigorous demands of Chicago Medical School, and finally to New York City, where she was building her career as a physician. That Monday afternoon seemed ordinary enough. She sat at her computer, fingers dancing across the keyboard as she chatted with her mother Ansu through instant messenger for 2 hours, sharing stories about a fun night out and making plans for the week ahead. The conversation was warm and easy, the kind that mothers and daughters share when distance separates them, but love bridges the gap. Around 4 in the afternoon, Sneha logged off and prepared to run some errands. She gathered clothes to drop off at the neighborhood dry cleaners, a mundane task that punctuated the rhythm of city life. Afterward, she made her way to Century 21, the famous discount department store that had become a destination for New Yorkers seeking designer goods at reasonable prices. The store stood close to her apartment, just a short walk from the towering presence of the World Trade Center that dominated the downtown skyline. Using the couple's American Express card, Sneha browsed through the racks with the focused attention of someone shopping with purpose. She selected lingerie, a dress, pantyhose, and bed linens, then moved to an annex where she chose 3 pairs of shoes. A security camera captured her image as she moved through the coat department, her figure immortalized in grainy footage that would later be scrutinized frame by frame. This surveillance recording, along with the credit card receipts, would become the last confirmed proof that Sneha and Philip had existed in the world as herself, making choices and moving through space like any other person on any other day. But after she left Century 21 that evening, Sneha vanished. She simply ceased to be anywhere that could be documented or verified. Her husband Ron Lieberman, an emergency room resident at Jacobi Medical Center in the Bronx, had been working the overnight shift. When he returned home that night, Sneha was not there. This absence did not immediately alarm him. Their marriage, while loving in many ways, had developed patterns that allowed for independence and space. Sneha sometimes stayed out overnight without informing him, and Ron had learned not to worry excessively about these disappearances. He prepared for his next shift and left again early the next morning, still without seeing his wife. It was not until the morning of September 11th, when he heard the devastating news that a plane had struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center, just 2 blocks from their apartment, that fear gripped his heart. Ron immediately began calling everyone who might have heard from Sneha, her friends, her family, anyone who might know where she was. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. She had vanished into the night of September 10th, and had not emerged on the morning that would change the world forever. The story of how Sneha and Philip came to be in New York City on that fateful day began decades earlier and in an ocean away. She was born on October 7th, 1969, in Kerala, a lush province on the southern coast of India, known for its backwaters, coconut palms, and deeply rooted traditions. Her parents, Ansu and Philip, were educated and ambitious, and when Sneha was still a small child, they made the momentous decision to immigrate to the United States, seeking opportunities and a different life for their family. The Philip family settled in New York, where Sneha grew up navigating between 2 worlds: the traditional Indian values her parents held dear, and the American culture that surrounded her in school and among friends. She had 2 brothers, Ashwin and John, and together they formed a tight-knit family unit that valued education, achievement, and mutual support. Sneha was, by all accounts, a creative and vibrant person whose interests extended far beyond academics. Her brother Ashwin remembered her as someone who loved painting, writing, and music, someone who saw beauty and possibility in the world around her. Her mother Ansu would later describe her as kind, compassionate, beautiful inside and outside, a daughter who brought light into her family's life. Yet Sneha also felt the weight of expectations. Her father was a doctor, and the path toward medicine seemed both natural and inevitable. She excelled academically, earning admission to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, one of the most prestigious institutions in the country. After completing her undergraduate degree in 1995, she followed in her father's footsteps and entered the Chicago School of Medicine, embarking on the long, demanding journey toward becoming a physician. It was in Chicago, amid the intensity of medical training, that Sneha met Ron Lieberman. Ron was originally from Los Angeles, a white Jewish man who was a year behind Sneha in the medical program. They were, in many ways, an unlikely pair, coming from vastly different cultural and religious backgrounds, but they found in each other something rare and precious. Ron would later describe Sneha as amazing, vibrant, goofy, silly, and elegant, everything he had been looking for and lucky enough to find. Their connection was immediate and deep. Sneha, eager to align their graduation dates and perhaps hungry for adventure, took a year off from school to travel with Ron through Italy. They wandered through ancient cities, tasted wine in Tuscan vineyards, and dreamed about their future together. In 1999, Both graduated from medical school, their achievements hard-won after years of study, exams, sleepless nights, and constant competition with other brilliant students. Both Sneha and Ron received invitations to complete their residency internships in New York City, a homecoming of sorts for Sneha, and an exciting new chapter for them as a couple. Ron was placed at Jacobi Medical Center in the Bronx, while Sneha began her residency at Cabrini Medical Center in Manhattan. They found an apartment in Battery Park City, a neighborhood known for its waterfront views, tree-lined streets, and reputation as one of the safest areas in Manhattan. The apartment on Rector Place was close to Sneha's work and gave them a comfortable base from which to build their life together. On the surface, everything seemed to be falling into place. Two young doctors, recently married, living in one of the most exciting cities in the world, with promising careers ahead of them. But beneath that surface, invisible fault lines were beginning to form. Sneha's time at Cabrini Medical Center did not go smoothly. Residency is notoriously grueling, demanding long hours, immense responsibility, and the ability to function under extreme pressure. Somewhere during this period, Sneha began to struggle. Reports would later surface indicating that she had developed issues related to alcohol, drinking in ways that interfered with her professional performance. The hospital administration took notice. When her contract came up for renewal, Cabrini Medical Center made the difficult decision not to extend it, citing these alcohol-related concerns. For someone who had worked so hard to reach this point, who had sacrificed and studied and pushed herself through years of demanding education, this rejection must have been devastating. She had not completed her first residency, and the question of why hung over her like a shadow. Sneha found a second chance at St. Vincent's Medical Center on Staten Island. She entered this new position hoping to prove herself, to overcome whatever difficulties had plagued her at Cabrini. But the fresh start did not bring the resolution she needed. St. Vincent's required her to attend meetings with a substance abuse counselor, an acknowledgement that her problems were recognized and needed to be addressed. Sneha, however, did not show up to these required meetings. Her absence was noted, and the hospital responded by suspending her from the residency program. Her medical career, once so full of promise, was now in serious jeopardy. The dream she had worked toward since childhood was slipping through her fingers. At the same time, Sneha's personal life was becoming increasingly complicated. According to police reports that would later be compiled, her marriage to Ron was experiencing strain. Sneha had begun going out at night without telling her husband where she was or when she would return. Sometimes she would stay out all night, coming home the next day with little explanation. Some of these nights were spent at lesbian bars, where witnesses reported seeing her meet women and leave with them. Adding to the mounting pressure, Sneha faced legal trouble. She had been involved in an incident at a bar that resulted in her spending a night in jail. More seriously, she had filed a complaint against a colleague, a male co-resident from Cabrini Medical Center, accusing him of groping her during a night out in June 2001. The colleague denied the allegations, and after an investigation, police determined that Sneha had filed a false complaint. She was arrested and charged with this misdemeanor offense. The criminal charge hung over her as she navigated the wreckage of her professional life and the tensions in her marriage. On the morning of September 10, 2001, Sneha appeared in court to be formally arraigned on the charge of filing a false complaint. She stood before the judge and pleaded not guilty. According to police records, she and Ron had a big fight at the courthouse afterward, an argument that centered on her recent troubles and her unexplained nights away from home. The confrontation ended with Sneha storming off, leaving Ron to go home alone while she disappeared into the city. What happened next remains one of the most haunting mysteries connected to the September 11th attacks. Sneha spent the afternoon of September 10th at home, apparently calm and content as she repotted orchids and chatted online with her mother. During that conversation, she mentioned that she might visit Windows on the World, the famous restaurant at the top of the North Tower, and do some shopping at the mall in the World Trade Center. Later that afternoon, she went out to run errands, dropping off clothes at the dry cleaners before making her purchases at Century 21. A store clerk would later recall seeing Sneha that evening, remembering that she had come in frequently, and that on this particular visit, she had been accompanied by another young woman, possibly Indian. Yet when Ron Lieberman reviewed weeks of security footage from the store, he saw his wife browsing alone in the coat department with no one else visible in the frame. After Sneha left Century 21 with her bags of new clothes and shoes, the documented record of her existence ends. She did not come home that night. Ron worked his shift at Jacobi Medical Center and returned to an empty apartment. The next morning, as he prepared to leave for work again, Sneha still had not returned. And then, at 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 17 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower. The world watched in horror as smoke billowed into the clear blue sky, as people trapped in the burning buildings made impossible choices, as the towers that had defined the New York skyline collapsed into mountains of twisted steel and concrete dust. Nearly 3,000 people died that day, their lives extinguished in moments of unimaginable terror and chaos. When Ron heard the news of the attacks, his first thought was of Sneha. He called everyone he could think of, desperately seeking any information about his wife's whereabouts. No one had seen her since the previous evening. In the days that followed, as the city reeled from the tragedy and families desperately searched for missing loved ones, Ron posted flyers with Sneha's photograph, hoping someone would remember seeing her. Sneha was initially listed among the victims of the September 11th attacks, her name added to the growing roster of those presumed dead. Her family clung to a theory that made sense of the senseless, that Sneha, with her medical training and her compassionate heart, had been near the World Trade Center when the planes hit, that she had rushed toward the towers to help the injured, and that she had perished in the collapse while trying to save others. It was a narrative that honored her memory and gave meaning to her loss, transforming her disappearance into an act of heroism. Ron hired a private investigator named Ken Gallant, a former FBI agent, to help him search for answers. Gallant uncovered 2 pieces of evidence that suggested Sneha might have returned to the apartment building on the morning of September 11th. The first was a phone call made from the couple's home phone to Ron's cell phone early that morning. The second was footage from security cameras in the apartment lobby that showed movement consistent with someone entering the building. These clues were tantalizing but inconclusive. Had Sneha come home during the night or early morning? Had she been in the apartment when the attacks began? If so, had she looked out the window, seen the smoke and flames, and run toward the towers to help? But as months passed and the official investigation into Sneha's disappearance deepened, a different picture began to emerge. The New York City Police Department conducted a thorough investigation that delved into every aspect of Sneha's life in the months leading up to September 10th. Detectives uncovered the details of her professional struggles, her termination from 2 residency programs, her substance abuse issues, and the pending criminal charge against her. They documented her nights out, her visits to bars, and the allegations about her extramarital encounters. They noted the fight with Ron at the courthouse on the morning of her disappearance. When the police compiled their findings into a report, the portrait of Sneha and Philip that emerged was starkly different from the one her family cherished. It was the image of a woman whose life was unraveling, someone facing professional ruin, legal trouble, and personal turmoil. In January 2004, based on the evidence in the police report, the city medical examiner removed Sneha from the official list of September 11th victims. The decision was a devastating blow to her family. In 2006, a surrogates court judge, Renee Roth, reviewed the case and ruled that there was no clear evidence establishing that Sneha had died on September 11th. The judge suggested that it was equally possible she had intentionally disappeared or had been murdered by someone she met during one of her nights out. The court set Sneha's legal date of death as September 10th, 2004, 3 years after she was reported missing, in accordance with state law. For Sneha's mother Ansu, the ruling was unbearable. She told reporters that it was more peaceful to think that her daughter had died trying to help others at the World Trade Center than to imagine that someone had killed her. Being denied the recognition of Sneha as a September 11th victim added another layer of grief to the family's suffering. Ron Lieberman and the Phillip family fought back. They refused to accept the narrative that had been constructed around Sneha's final hours. Ron insisted that the fight at the courthouse had never happened, that Sneha's nights out had been innocent, and that the problems in their life, whatever they were, did not explain what had happened to his wife. John Phillip maintained that the allegations about his girlfriend were completely false, fabricated by police for reasons he could not understand. The family hired lawyers and appealed the court's decision, determined to restore Sneha's name to the list of September 11th victims. On January 31, 2008, more than 6 years after Sneha disappeared, a New York State appeals court overturned the lower court's ruling. Justice David Sachs, writing for the appeals court, acknowledged that there was no direct proof irrefutably establishing that Sneha had been at the World Trade Center during the attacks. However, he argued that the evidence made it highly probable that she had died that morning at that site, whereas any other conclusion required only the rankest speculation. The court declared that Sneha and Phillip had been a victim of the September 11th attacks, officially making her the 2,751st victim of the Twin Towers collapse. Her name was added to the memorial honoring those who lost their lives that day, giving her family a place to grieve and remember her. Yet even with this legal victory, the mystery of Sneha and Phillip's disappearance remains unsolved. No body was ever found. Her passport and credit cards were left behind in her apartment, suggesting she had not planned to disappear permanently. Police thoroughly investigated Ron and ruled him out as a suspect, convinced by his tireless efforts to find his wife and his genuine devastation at her loss. The items Sneha purchased at Century 21 that evening, the lingerie, the dress, the bed linens, the shoes, were never found, raising questions about where she went after leaving the store. Did she meet someone that night? Did she return home and then leave again the next morning? Was she near the World Trade Center when the plane struck? The theories about what happened to Sneha are numerous and contradictory. Some believe she used the chaos of September 11th to disappear intentionally, escaping a life that had become overwhelming with professional failure, legal problems, and personal conflict. Others think she met with foul play on the night of September 10th, that she encountered someone dangerous during one of her nights out and was killed. Still others, including her family, believe that she was near the towers on the morning of September 11th, that her medical training compelled her to rush toward the disaster to help the injured, and that she died when the buildings collapsed. Each theory has its proponents, but none has definitive proof. In the years since Sneha's disappearance, new technologies have offered glimmers of hope. The New York City Medical Examiner's Office has used cutting-edge DNA analysis to test thousands of bone fragments recovered from ground zero, some as small as a tic-tac, in an effort to identify more of the victims who were never accounted for. As of the 20th anniversary of the attacks in 2021, approximately 1,100 victims remained unidentified. The possibility exists, however remote, that one day forensic scientists will match DNA from one of these fragments to Sneha and Phillip, providing the definitive proof that she died at the World Trade Center as her family has always believed. The story of Sneha and Phillip defies simple conclusions. She was a woman of intelligence and talent, someone who had overcome significant obstacles to achieve her dreams. She was also someone who struggled in ways that her family either did not see or did not want to acknowledge. The two versions of her life, the compassionate doctor her family describes and the troubled woman documented in police reports, are not necessarily contradictory. Human beings contain multitudes, and it is possible for someone to be kind and creative and loving while also grappling with addiction, depression, and choices that cause pain to themselves and others. The tragedy of Sneha's story is not just that she disappeared, but that her disappearance occurred at a moment in history so catastrophic that it swallowed individual stories into a collective trauma, making it nearly impossible to separate her fate from the larger horror of that day. Ron Lieberman has never remarried. He remains close to Sneha's family, united with them in their loss and their unanswered questions. Every year on September 11th, when the names of the victims are read aloud at memorial ceremonies, Sneha and Philip's name is spoken. It is listed on the bronze panels of the National September 11th Memorial at the World Trade Center site, carved into metal alongside nearly 3,000 others. For visitors who pause to touch her name, she is simply another victim of that terrible day, her individual story unknown to them. But for those who knew her and loved her, Sneha remains a profound mystery, a talented young woman whose life was cut short in circumstances that may never be fully understood, whose final hours remain trapped in the shadows between the evening of September 10th and the morning that changed the world forever.